Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. So glad you can join me and I can join you during your lunchtime. Listen, if you are watching us on YouTube, I appreciate it greatly. Please subscribe and leave a review and a rating, etc. If you are watching us and you would like to listen to us, we are found wherever fine podcasts are purveyed. Please subscribe there, leave a review, leave a rating. We appreciate all of those things. Tell your friends, tell your family members all about the Lunch Hour. Very excited to bring our guest on for really what is going to be our last lunch hour of 2023. Her name is Karol Markowicz. She is a journalist, author, and public commentator renowned for her insightful analysis on a range of topics from politics and culture to education and family life. Born in the Soviet Union and raised in Brooklyn, we're going to talk about both those things. Markowitz's experiences as an immigrant have deeply influenced her perspectives in writing. She has established herself as a prominent voice in contemporary journalism, has contributed to numerous esteemed publications, including the New York Post, where her columns are known for their incisive critique and advocacy for free speech and classical liberal values. Her book, Stolen Youth, was co-written with Bethany Mandel, who I do a lot of work with on O'Connor and Company on WMAL. It's a pivotal work that delves into the impact of the pandemic's policies on children. The book examines the consequences of school closures, social distancing, and other COVID-19 measures, arguing that those policies have caused significant, potentially long-lasting harm to the younger generation. Through meticulous research and compelling narratives, Stolen Youth sheds light on the overlooked struggles of children and teenagers during the pandemic and calls for a reevaluation of such policies in the future. Markowitz's expertise extends beyond journalism into public speaking, where she is highly sought after for her engaging and thought-provoking presentations. She often appears on radio and television, offering her perspectives on current events and societal trends. She is the host of the Karol Markowicz Show. We're going to find out all about that. And now lives in South Florida with her husband and children. And Karol, so glad. Let me tell you something. I told one of my buddies I was having you on, and he was like, that is an amazing get.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really nice to be here.
Thanks. So let's start here, because as I said to you before we started the show, I was a Soviet studies major in college, and I still have a great affinity for those things. Mm-hmm. I was telling you, I want to do this panel of Soviet expats who have become conservatives and libertarians and scholars and activists. And so let's talk here. Where were you born? When did you migrate? I mean, how was that transition? And how did you go from living in Soviet, I'm assuming it was Soviet Russia, but I could very well be wrong, to living in Brooklyn?
I was born in Russia. My father's from Ukraine. Both sides of my family are originally from Belarus, were displaced post-World War II. Wow. My parents met in Turkmenistan. So I have the full Soviet Union map in my background.
Wait, time out. How did your parents go from Belarus and Ukraine to Turkmenistan?
Well, my father was a doctor, my mother was a teacher, and for Jews, you didn't get a choice as to where you went. Right. So they went to Turkmenistan. They were sent to Turkmenistan to work where they met there.
Sure.
So, and so my father was living in Ukraine, my mother was in Russia, and my father had just always dreamt of America, freedom, the free world. And there was a small opening during the Gerald Ford presidency where they pushed for Soviet Jews to be released. I like to say it's one of the few times in world history where being Jewish was an advantage. So they allowed Soviet Jews to apply to leave. And so what happened is, and I love to talk about this, especially now because of what's happening with our immigration policies. But basically, you needed somebody to sponsor you. So a lot of synagogues in the U.S. sponsored people to come and assured that when that family arrived in America, they would be fully taken care of, no government benefits at all, no, nothing for free. And that's how we got to America. And it was the late 70s. I was about 2 years old. And I was raised in Brooklyn, grew up with the idea that, my life could have easily gone so differently. Sure. My father got permission to leave a year before my mother did. She was pregnant with me at the time. And he went, and my mom's family was like, and you're never going to see him again.
No.
Thinking like,
Sure, of course.
a guy who like, he's off. But everything, worked out, and I got to be raised an American, the best,
That's fantastic.
best of all possible outcomes.
It's interesting because I visited the Soviet Union in '89, and obviously it was a slightly different environment then. It's funny because I was fascinated by Russia, throughout my teenage years for a lot of different reasons. This was not one of them, but I am reminded of your story. There was on Saturday Night Live, when Saturday Night Live was still funny, there was a Red Guys rap. And one of them was about part of the rap was about exit visas for Jews, being able to get out.
Funny. Uh-huh.
See, when they were funny.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I turn around and I've still become fascinated by sort of the remnants of Jews in Central Europe. My family's from Romania, Ukraine, Belarus, as you're talking about. I don't know if you're at all familiar with the so-called Jewish Autonomous Republic of Birobidzhan.
Of course, yes.
But, that has always fascinated me, this idea that the Soviets tried to set up this nominal republic, but really to get the Jews out of the way.
Right.
Talk a little bit about what you know about Birobidzhan and again, this issue of religious freedom and totalitarianism.
So it was a funny story because that was set up, as a favor for Soviet Jews. Hey, would you like to live in this frozen tundra? Yes. Thank you very much for that. There was one of my favorite fiction writers, a woman named Alina Adams, wrote a fictional but based on a true story account of her family living in that autonomous region. I forget the name of the book, but her name is Alina Adams. Look it up. She's fantastic. The book, I read it in like one day. I just think she's such a fantastic writer. And it was about that region and about how people ended up there and about how life went there. It was really interesting.
Amazing.
Because they were still expected to keep up like the communist, philosophies, and live up to unrealistic expectations of growing, food and just all kinds of things. It's a really interesting story.
I am dying to go and visit. This is part of my old fantasy. When the war ends, we'll talk a little bit about the war in a moment. I want to get to Romania. I would like to get back to Russia at some point in time, but I really want to get to places like Birobidzhan just to see what that was like. So let's talk about, growing up in Brooklyn. I'm sure you were part of, within the whole Russian enclave, the Soviet expat enclave.
Yep.
And with the specific subset of Soviet Jews living in Brooklyn. Now listen, I grew up just north of the city. I grew up in Westchester County. I went to high school in the Bronx, went to a school that was had a large Jewish population.
Is that Bronx Science?
No, I went to the Fieldston School.
Fieldston School. Okay.
Yes, ethical humanism, which, as someone pointed out to me, is Jewish socialism or faith without faith. So I was surrounded by the secular progressive Jews.
Yeah.
But you were, I think, amongst much, much more conservative and certainly more religious oriented Jews. Talk about that aspect of your life growing up.
It's funny because Jews are, largely considered liberals. But what I always like to point out to people is that you get any immigrant Jewish population and they're going to be conservatives. So ex-Soviet Jews who live in Brooklyn, very conservative, largely Republican voting. Syrian Jews, Iranian Jews, basically any immigrant Jewish population that you're going to encounter. Venezuelan Jews I've gotten to know in South Florida. All conservative. So that's really what life in Brooklyn was like.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I can only imagine what the Seder table is like at a Venezuelan Jewish Seder. That's got to be amazing.
I got to get you an invite.
Please. I would come down for that.
Yeah. So that's the thing is, I get asked a lot, like, how was it being a conservative in Brooklyn? And for most of my life, it was fine. It was more than fine. It was, my community was just like me. And so I didn't feel weird about it. When we were towards the end of our Brooklyn life, we were living in Park Slope, like the most far left area ever.
Oh, yes.
And even before COVID, I would say being an open conservative in super left Park Slope was fine. It was okay. But the woke mind virus that has taken hold in the last decade, but really in the last like 4 years since COVID hit, really changed everything. Before that, Brooklyn was a wonderful place to live. It's where we imagined raising our children, and being a conservative was, totally okay.
And it must have been, it must have been hard to make the transition from Brooklyn down to South Florida for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the summertime climate's got to be markedly
I
different.
love it.
But do you?
Yeah, I love heat. It's 70 degrees today. I'm like in my warm sweater.
That's fantastic. That's so funny. Yeah, it was 34 degrees this morning here in DC. It's going to get down to the 20s tonight. Tomorrow's the cold day of the week. Anyway, not to sort of digress there.
No, we love talking about weather.
Let's talk about the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when you moved down to Florida. It was during the pandemic.
It'll be 2 years in January. So okay. January 22.
Okay. So, but we'll talk about that and your book and your kids, because listen, like you. So I've got 2 girls. Mm-hmm. I don't talk about them much on this show, but I got 2 girls. One of them was a senior in high school when the lockdowns happened. The other one was a sophomore in high school. Oof. And we watched, obviously I've seen both when they were in school and then when they've both gone off to college. And the one thing I know is, and I'm not going to, I would normally, if I were I was a private company, I would drop the F-bomb here. But the more that the kids were in lockdown, the more messed up they were when they got to college, the more they couldn't handle college. Right. One of my children had a roommate who couldn't deal with the fact that she was living with someone else. And it was a whole thing. My daughter comes home one day to her room and the roommate says, "I can't live with you anymore. You need to leave." And which my daughter was like, why do I have to leave? And
right.
Anyway, but anyway, talk about Stolen Youth, written with Bethany Mandel, aka Bethany Shondark. Let's talk about this.
So Stolen Youth, it has a chapter on COVID, but it's not specifically about COVID. It kicks off with COVID because, again, we see that as a real starting place for a lot of the issues that we're facing today. The pandemic is over, but a lot of the problems continue. Like you said, the college student who can't live with other people. I hear these stories all the time, and in just so many different ways. Like my child doesn't know how to function. My child is academically several years behind. My child has deep anxiety problems, all these kind of stuff. I think a lot of it can be traced back to that time period. You could take it back a little further, where I think we were seeing, again, what we describe as the woke mind virus,
sure.
Taking effect before the pandemic. But what happened during the pandemic is that parents got to see up close over their kids' shoulder in the dining room what they were actually learning, and they were
sure.
shocked by it. So the pandemic exacerbated these problems, and the restrictions on kids going to school or on masking, it targeted the poorest children.
Right.
The teachers' unions knew what they were doing. They were specifically targeting the poorest children. They knew that rich people wouldn't be able to be controlled the way that the poor would, and they targeted the poorest areas, the poorest schools, kept them out of school the longest, kept them masked the longest. I like to say that where I was living was super, super left, Park Slope, and none of them said one word about opening schools. Instead, right. They got pods for their families. They moved to their beach house and they sent them to schools there. They got a private tutor. They went to private school because obviously private schools in New York City were open while public
sure.
schools were closed. So all of this comes to a head during COVID. And I think we're going to be crawling out of this for a very, very long time. I think so many kids are so messed up. And I keep waiting for the Republicans to sort of, pounce or seize or whatever the New York Times likes to say on this issue, because so many kids are still suffering. But the Republicans largely don't know how to capitalize on it, don't know how to have the conversation, don't know how to say to parents, look, if your kid can't read and they're in 4th grade, trace it back to why they can't read. It's because they were kept out of schools.
Is this similar to the Republicans not being able to understand what was happening on the ground during the early days of the Tea Party movement? Right, this idea was there's popular discontent, and the Republican power structure was very skeptical of that. They didn't know quite how to capitalize it. I remember having conversations with a number of folks, in that establishment realm, like, no, we don't want these people around. We don't know what's gonna happen, right? Because there are activists out there who have capitalized. One of the best stories, obviously, is, here in the DC area is Loudoun County and the sort of the retake over the Loudoun County schools.
Yeah.
So you have parents who understand what's going on, but it's the seasoned politicians, or is it all about power for them and they don't want to give up their power very
See,
easily?
I'll give them the charitable explanation, which
Sure.
is they're lazy. They're
Yeah.
actually just lazy. They look at the polls and they say parents don't care about what happened during the pandemic. Okay, maybe, but maybe parents aren't connecting the problems that their kids are having today to the problems that that should have been dealt with during the pandemic policies and during that time period. So again, if your kid is 10, 11 years old and has a speech issue, is it possible that started while they were
Maybe.
being masked in their schools every single day, and only the kids were being masked to that extent? Grown-ups were wandering around cities having dinner and lunch at restaurants and whatever, but kids were eating on the ground in New York City in their public schools, masking between bites. Perhaps they can be, we can draw the connection for them. You can't just look at polls and say people don't care about this, people don't care about this.
Right.
Explain what the connection is and why they should care about it. And I think that's what, in Virginia, I really feel like that's what the governor did to make people care. He drew connections, he explained things. He didn't just expect that, oh, people care about this, I'm gonna talk about it. He made them care about it.
Let's take a step back and talk about this issue of stolen youth. Let's talk about it outside of the pandemic, as you rightly point out. Because there are all kinds of places that I can go. I want to ultimately end up talking about what's going on college campuses, the anti-Semitism issues, which I think have their roots in all kinds of places.
Yeah.
But it reminds me of a conversation I had. One of my kids' friends' fathers, very politically active, very progressive, was at one point, he puts up on his Facebook page, was driving over to the elementary school, saw a car speeding away, and my daughter said, well, gee, I hope there wasn't a mass shooting. To which I responded, and maybe I shouldn't have, but I couldn't resist. I said, I think actually this is much more of a reflection on your parenting and what you're teaching your kids than the actual threats. And that was the beginning of the end of my friendship with this father who later unfriended me and blocked me. But you have that. There's a certain degree of this indoctrination that goes on, and eventually this leads to what we're seeing on college campuses these days, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. So stolen youth is about how the indoctrination that people assume happens on college campuses, it does happen on college campuses, but it starts way younger than that.
Sure.
I tell the story of my first grader in Brooklyn. He's now in 5th in Florida, but when he was in 1st grade, we had switched him schools after the school year started, and his new school was having a climate protest. And, today I would sit him out 100%, but then I didn't want him to be the weird new kid who was sitting out this protest. So he marched around his, outside the school, and he had a sign that says, Earth dies, we die. Like, why is my first grader marching around against climate change? What do you want him to do about it? He has no capacity. I have no capacity to change anything. He certainly has no capacity to change anything. Perhaps we should have like the kids in China and in India and in the developed world that can maybe actually affect something. Possibly, maybe, probably even not. Maybe we should have them marching around, because my kid marching around with a sign does absolutely nothing but increase his anxiety about the world ending. And, I talk about this a lot and people don't like it, but I don't think we should be teaching climate change to kindergarten, 1st grade, etc., elementary school. Why?
Agreed.
If you're trying to say like, oh, it should be a science, it's taught in science. I can assure you they're not taught the science of this. My kids were spent weeks learning about Greta Thunberg. They didn't learn about the science of any climate change. They learned that there's a Swedish girl with pigtails who doesn't go to school, and maybe you should too. So all of that is aimed at kids to give them this framework to be good little activists.
Yeah.
And what you learn, actually, we talk about this in Stolen Youth, but Greta Thunberg didn't wake up one day and decide to be a climate activist. She had grown-up activists give her this idea and say, look, in Parkland, Florida, after the shooting at Stoneman Douglas Marjorie High School, the kids became anti-gun activists. We can follow the same model. She actually picked it up from them. And you can't argue with kids. You are not going to say to a child, this isn't real, or what you're worried about is not going to happen. Because, she's a kid, they're
Yes.
kids. And so they realized that using kids to make their arguments were basically bulletproof.
Unless they disagree with you, unless they're just trying to live their lives, in which case then you take a picture of someone with an awkward smile on their face and you go and you destroy their lives. Let me posit, because I have you on, Karol Markowicz, and you didn't grow up, you were born in the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
A Soviet premier comes to the United Nations and he says in a speech, "We will be at your funeral." Doesn't say we will bury you, says we will be at your funeral.
Mm-hmm.
And then he turns around and he dictates to his foreign intelligence services, "We are going to use the benefits, the rights, the responsibilities, the privileges that are afforded in Western liberal democracies. We are going to use them against those Western liberal democracies. And we're going to infiltrate academia. We're going to give money to activist causes. We're going to turn these people in these countries against one another, so that in 50 years, they're not going to know what end is up." Does that sound bizarre to you, or is that something you think could have actually occurred and helps to explain what we're seeing today in schools and on college campuses? What are your thoughts here?
It has absolutely occurred. In our book, we trace the way Marxist education is pushed at every level of our system. Yeah. They literally use our system against us. They use our openness and our willingness to listen to people and to be nice and all of that against us. That doesn't mean we should change our system, but that does mean we should be a little bit more aware of what's going on around us. There was a there was a KGB agent who made this video, Yuri Bezmenov, and it's been viral a number of times, where he says that the stages of destroying a country is you infiltrate their institutions and you turn people against each other and that kind of thing. The only thing I would say about that, and the video is worth watching, look up Yuri Bezmenov. It's very interesting. But the only thing I would say about that is he made the prediction that the U.S. would be destroyed ultimately because of this. But he made that prediction in the 1980s. So it's been a little while now, and we have not been destroyed. I think we have a amazing, deep history. And we come from a place where we have such a good foundation that we're able to rebut these attacks. But I think people need to understand these attacks are real, and these attacks are coming, and they're aimed at your children because the children are the easiest group of the population to indoctrinate.
And now that we have the technology, now that there's the technology out there, and I'm not a Luddite, I love technology. I love having access to all kinds of information at my fingertips. But we have to remember that this enables these nations to sort of weaponize their abilities here, right? So you get somebody like a Vladimir Putin who comes in, who's a Chekist, as we would call him, someone who's got a long-standing relationship with the Russian intelligence services, and he's going to use these things. And what we know of the Chinese intelligence services as well. Listen, before we get to some of your top stories of the year, because I do want to hear that, and that's why we're having you on. It gets to another thing that bothers me and is of deep and abiding concern. And because you're a conservative, you and I can have this conversation, and which is this issue of the invasion of Ukraine, the war that Russia is perpetrating, and the what's the best way to put it? Not the mixed bag, but not split personality, but the seeming inability of the conservative movement, formerly the hawkiest of the hawks when it came to Russia, to be able to come together to find a coherent message here. Yeah. Because it's not just right. There's some of it that gets couched in, well, we need accountability, and of course we need accountability. And there's some of it which is, well, other folks should be doing their role, and we need border security first. All things I agree with. But in the end, there are some folks within the conservative movement who don't understand the threat, and they don't think the United States has an obligation here. How did the conservative movement come to this point? What happened? Where do you think, again, it's not stolen youth now, it's stolen conservatives vis-a-vis Russia?
It's interesting because I think that what happened, and it's not just happening in their perspective of Ukraine, it's happening on a wide range of other subjects. I think people have been lied to for so long that they just expect that everything is a lie.
Yeah.
I think that in the last, 15 years, we just had so many things disproved and so many previously held beliefs kind of destroyed that I don't know that people trust anymore. I mean, again,
Right.
going back to COVID, it's related. Um, Institutions lost a large amount of trust. So I think rebuilding that trust is deeply important before you can even have the conversations of, look, this is a true story, this is what's happening here is true, this is
Right.
real, and this is why you should care about this. Let's say, on the issue of Ukraine, I think people feel misled,
Yeah.
and that's the conversations that I'm having with conservatives, where they're like, what's the truth here? And they might think, oh yeah, we need to defeat Russia for sure, but have kind of reservations about aiding Ukraine
Right.
because they're not sure what the true story is.
Absolutely.
So to me, that would be the biggest hurdle. I have a personal just connection. Obviously, I had a family who had to evacuate from Ukraine when the war
Yeah.
began. I have cousins still in Russia who, I'm just every day is a hoping that they don't get drafted to the front.
Sure.
So it's really tough. I would love to see a some kind of resolution here. I don't know that we're any closer to it today than we were a year ago. I wish we had more capable leadership in the U.S. to guide us.
Right.
All around, it's really tough.
It's funny, you sort of going back to this, the progressive movement and New York progressives, et cetera. I was, entertaining isn't the right word. My high school sends a group of students every other year down to CPAC. And we were talking about issues, and I was talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And I posited a question to them. I said, okay, so we know the only part of the Russian economy that works is their oil economy. How many of you think that defeating Russia is vitally important? And they almost all of them raised their hands. I said, okay, so how many of you who believe that what the United States ought to do is massively ramp up oil production to bottom out the oil market and bank up the Russian economy? And there was a greater hesitation there. And a couple of students came out and said, no, climate change is the bigger problem than the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, that's it. I'm just saying, like, they're lied to. So what do they imagine? That climate change ceases to exist when Russia's producing the oil? Like,
right.
We shouldn't be producing the oil because only us producing the oil fuels climate change? It's just, it's so frustrating to talk to these young people who just don't have any concept of how the world works.
But let me be really clear about this. I don't think this is a position that is just among the young people. I mean, I think you have, older Democrats as well who are like, no, can't ramp up the oil production, right? We've made this recommendation to the Biden administration. And I know other folks who are more moderate than I am have made this recommendation, and they have been rebuffed because for them, it's climate change uber alles for a whole host of reasons. But this is where we are, right? It's a situation. It's a huge problem. So let's talk about some of the other stories, because it is 2024, 2023, almost 2024. What are you thinking about as you think of the biggest stories of the year? What are some of the things that come to mind?
Well, it's since October 7th, it's been really hard to think of anything else. And it's tough because I think that we have so many issues in America that are not getting, the kind of treatment maybe they should be getting. Although on things like the border, for example, we have all the information. We have all the news. We know what is going on. People are crossing our border brazenly, waving at our agents who are not trying to stop them. So it has to be more of a policy change. I don't think that having the border be a bigger news story would really do anything. It's already quite a big news story. So October 7th sort of has overtaken a lot of my thinking. And not just what's going on in Israel, although that, that was a big deal to me. I have family in Israel, et cetera. But it's the reaction around the world has been tough for Jews to see. I can't say that I was naive to it. I always
Sure.
pretty much knew that anti-Semitism had never gone away, and I still have such a healthy belief in the American, population. I think that Americans have been easily the best about protecting their Jews of all the countries I can think of. But what's been going on college campuses has been startling. It's really scared a lot of people. A lot of conversations that I'm having right now go on around that. And you have, the thinking that like, oh, we don't want to limit freedom of speech on campuses. Well, yeah, I never wanted to limit freedom of speech on campuses, but if you haven't noticed, in the last decade, there hasn't been freedom of speech on campus. Right. Try marching around saying men can't get pregnant and see what happens. You're going to be kicked out. So the idea that now we need the freedom of speech to be able to say, let's kill Jews is a little too convenient for me. So that's been the main issue for me coming out of 2023.
Again, and I don't think folks understand, again, not that this was going to be the podcast where we just beat up on the Soviet Union and Russia for a while,
not?
But a lot of folks, but why not? But right, is, a lot of folks don't understand that the roots of this inherent conflict between Israel and the Arab world, or Israel and Muslims, was fomented and supported by the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviets spent a great deal of time. Listen, to sort of turn it to elsewhere in that region. I spent some time in Algeria. The anniversary of that trip just came up.
Wow.
And dealing with Sahrawi refugee camps, the indigenous people of the Western Sahara, who have been living in refugee camps since the 1970s. And Morocco was a U.S. client state, and at the time Algeria was a Soviet client state. And so, the folks anyway. So the Soviets were doing what China is doing now, right? Which is to spread the word of Marx and Lenin and Mao and to turn these people against one another. So if the U.S. was supporting Israel, well, then the Soviets were going to support every other nation that was trying to destroy it, create this myth about Palestine and a Palestinian homeland. Anyway, I'm sorry. So go ahead, please.
No, that you're absolutely right. That it does have its origins. History very much is still with us, and that's where a lot of people should begin their story. I think that where we are is that a lot of these college kids are deeply misinformed. Every time I see Queers for Palestine, I'm just like, oh my God, you have no idea what you're talking about. I like the videos where the college kids or whoever are marching around and saying, from the river to the sea, and somebody asks them like which river, which sea, and they have no idea. So
just it's the river and the sea. They'll any river.
So
any
that should be
sea.
Disturbing to all Americans.
The Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean. So the East River, the East River. Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, not to make a joke about it.
No. I agree with you. Hudson to the Atlantic is probably what they mean.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. From the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. It is the sort of the inanity out there that sort of goes on, and you start poking into this, and it becomes an issue. And the other part of it is that there has been an impetus behind American Jews to assimilate. There is the detachment among many American Jews from their actual religion. It becomes a cultural issue as opposed to a matter of faith. Again, as someone who went to an ethical humanist high school, which was founded by Jews who no longer wanted to be identified as Jews, and then the other part of it is we want to go along to get along for a lot of reasons. And so it's speaking up is not. It's like the old adage of anybody who sort of speaks out in their own defense,
right?
They get ridiculed. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You.
No. I'm fully agreeing with you. I think that's where a lot of liberal Jews are so horrified and upset right now because they were expecting people to come to their defense.
Yeah.
And the truth is, the conservative world has been amazing. Once again, I feel like completely embraced by the conservative world, who are not seeing this as like, oh, well, both sides are kind of, no, they see that the horrific attack on October 7th was very much one-sided. It was, civilians being slaughtered, and they see the absolute glee and joy that people around the world were celebrating this attack, and they were excited and in the streets and so happy about it. Conservatives have been fantastic to Jews, and I hope that Jews in America understand that these are their friends. These are the people who care about them. These are the people who will defend them and won't go back to their, left-leaning liberals who only see them as oppressors.
Let's go down the other part of the path, which is the, Democratic Jews and their uneasiness. And part of the problem is that, again, they've had it hammered in their heads that, the only reason why conservatives are friends of Israel is because of the, evangelicals wanting to bring the second coming, of the whole trope about that. Or, they might otherwise come over to vote Republican, but they hate Donald Trump because for whatever reason, Trump broke their brains. How do we talk to Jewish Democrats who are very concerned about what this administration is doing, and about, considering voting Republican in 2024?
I mean, I'm very blunt, and I tell them to get a grip and to understand that this is the issue of the time for them. Yeah. Whatever else you care about, your survival should be right at the tippity top there. Again, if you're not confident in your political allies and the way that they treat you and whether they would come to your defense, as you're being actually murdered, and they wouldn't just stand over your body being like, well, actually, perhaps you were an oppressor, then maybe don't vote for those people. Sure. And so I'm pretty blunt. Again, I'm a lifelong conservative. I've been making these arguments for a long time. This isn't new to me. And the idea that Jews are liberals has never made sense to me ever. Yeah. But I always thought, like I said in the beginning of this conversation, it was always the immigrants who had seen some stuff that were conservatives. And it was the ones who had been in the US since the turn of the last century, who had missed the pogroms in Russia and who had missed the Holocaust and had missed so much anti-Semitism in Europe and in the old countries. Those people had gotten too comfortable and didn't realize that they were still somewhat different and they might be targeted for that difference at any time. So I would love to see Jews wake up and vote Republican and live Republican, live conservatively, arm themselves, understand that they need to protect themselves.
It's funny. We have a family mytho history, among my dad's generation. My dad's got three siblings, one of four siblings. And among them, the story was that back in the old country, back in Romania, our family was somehow Jewish aristocracy in Romania. And finally, I had to sit down with them and explain there was no such thing as Jewish aristocracy in the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. We lived in a bandit commune 8 miles west of the town where we all thought we were from. Right? We were kicked out. Now in the town where we were from, Jews could be in the timber trade. Yeah. Jews would own bars and breweries because they could serve alcohol on Sundays. Mm-hmm. But there was no such thing. And yes, my great grandfather was chased out of the home for a lot of reasons. Mm-hmm. So other things, just to get your thoughts on some of the big stories. Hunter Biden was reindicted. The day we're recording this is the day that he refused to testify before Congress. Mm-hmm. I spent some time listening. We're getting so your thoughts here, about the most recent indictment. Mm-hmm. I would submit that they waited until the last possible minute, and they're serving to protect him. We're never going to get to the root of this. Your thoughts here?
I'm pretty negative on this. I also don't think it's going anywhere. Every time a Hunter Biden scandal breaks, the Joe Biden administration moves him a little closer. They're not throwing him out. They're not saying, he did bad things and he should face repercussions. They keep covering for him and saying he did nothing wrong, and making sure that he is seen at the White House, understood to be part of the family and protected under that family. So, to keep the Soviet theme going, but, membership has its privileges. Right. And if you're part of the nomenclature, the team in charge, absolutely. you get a pass on anything that you're doing.
It is amazing. All right, before I let you go, let's start here. The Karol Markowicz Show. Talk to us all about this.
Karol Markowicz shows on iHeartRadio on Mondays and Thursdays, and it's largely non-political. I like to ask people about their marriages, about their kids, how they got started in their field, whether they think they made it. I think the question I ask everybody that does sometimes veer into the political is what our biggest societal problem is and whether it's solvable. So that kind of thing. I want to get into more than just news of the day. And I wanted to talk to people about, what makes them tick.
This gets into my next question, which is I had this, and I tell all of my guests about this. I'd had this theory for a podcast. Right now I have 3 podcasts. I think that's enough. I don't need a 4th. But I about a podcast called Outside Interests, which is to bring people who are involved in politics and policy, and to talk to them about their outside interests. So, when you're not speaking, when you're not writing, when you're not doing your show, when you're down in South Florida, what are you up to with your family, without your family? What are you up to? What are your outside interests?
I'm a big poker player.
Are you?
And I love playing poker. My husband and I play quite often, not so much recently. In the last few months, it's been kind of a break from that. But we love poker. I'm generally one of the few women at the table. I love it. I have been playing for, I don't even know, 15 years now.
Wow.
And I would say that's my main, hobby.
That's so cool.
And in my younger days, I definitely had moments where I supported myself playing poker. So
is that right? That is fantastic news.
Yeah.
Wow. That's by the way, it's the first time that's come up on the show. That's terrific. No. And see, I'm terrible. I'm terrible at poker. I'm because I'm sure. Yeah, that's exactly right. It was. The Competitive Enterprise Institute had at CPAC many years ago. They did a poker event like one night outside, and I was out in the first round. Like I thought I was going to bluff my way. You might very well have.
I think I might have. Yeah,
probably when I was out, and then I was outside sitting talking with Derek Hunter, a good friend of mine, another radio host out there. That is terrific. So how do folks find out more about what you're up to, Karol?
I'm on Twitter at Karol, just my first name. And I'm on Instagram and Facebook, like all the kids these days. But Twitter's my main space.
And by the way, thank you so very much. You tweeted out some stuff that I had been writing about an incident that was happening in Williamsburg, Virginia, regarding a menorah lighting ceremony. I was grateful that you tweeted that out and got some greater coverage on it. Ironically, real quick, while I have you on, I'll tell the story. So they were talking about doing some kind of a counter event. The local rabbis, both the Chabad rabbi and the Reform Temple rabbi, were like, we'd rather you just come to our events that we're having. And then they wound up canceling the second Sunday event anyway because of the weather. So, to me, sort of God spoke. That's exactly it. Karol Markowicz, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
This has been another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Please, as I've said, if you are watching us on YouTube, go and check us out, the audio files, wherever fine podcasts are found. Leave us a review, like us, recommend us, and vice versa. If you are listening to us and you want to see what Karol Markowicz looks like, you want to see what, God forbid, you want to see what I look like, go and check us out on YouTube on the Federal Newswire's channel. As I said, I'm Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.